Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Xeriscaping, Whole System Planning and Practice. My name is Sylvan Kaufman. I know I appear on your screen as Risa Edelstein, but that's a technical thing related to GoToWebinar. I work with the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, and I'm today's moderator for the webinar. I hope everyone, if you have any questions during the webinar, you can type in your questions in the question box, and there'll be a couple pauses during the webinar where I can relay questions to today's presenter. I want to welcome everyone today. This is a series of webinars that we're offering this year called A Focus on Sustainability. This series was developed in 2013 by a group of organizations known regionally in the United States for their quality education programs for professionals in the landscaping industries and landscape design. We're working together to expand the reach of these education programs through this webinar series. In case you're not familiar with the organizations, they're all nonprofit and largely volunteer groups, and they are the Ecological Landscaping Alliance in the northeastern United States, the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, CCLC, in the Washington, D.C. Mid-Atlantic area, the Midwest Ecological Landscape Alliance, MELA, and the Eco Landscape California, ELC. And so if any of you are members of that group, I welcome you. And if you're not, I would encourage you to check out the organization in your region and see what we're all about. Today's webinar, Xeriscaping, Whole System Planning and Practice, is presented by Ms. Christy Green. She's the founder of Earth Designs and Radicle in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Her goal is to design and implement artful, regenerative, and innovatively designed small and large-scale land projects which educate about and inspire stewardship of natural resources and appreciation of food and beauty as necessary components in daily life. So I think we can all get behind that idea, and I'm sure that all of us have some practices that we relate to in there. Ms. Green has a master's in landscape architecture from the University of New Mexico, and she teaches many classes and workshops on sustainable landscaping topics in the arid West, and this year will be a food justice artist in residence at the Santa Fe Institute. So welcome, Christy, and we look forward to the webinar. And
certainly if you have questions, I look forward to hearing them. And we're going to allow a couple different places in the talk itself to pause and hear your questions and hopefully provide some answers. And thank you very much. And I'm really excited that I get to talk to you all who are on the East Coast in such a different ecosystem than what we have here in Santa Fe. So what I want to talk about today, as Sylvan mentioned, is Xeriscape, Whole Systems Planning and Practice. And it's something that I've been trying to practice since I've been in the profession here in Santa Fe since 1999. And my intent was to start a landscape design build firm that was about edible landscapes and also regenerative landscapes that incorporate native plants and also wastewater, surface water, and precipitation water collection and reuse. So what I'll talk about today is some of our practices, and then I'll give lots of examples and show pictures of the ways we design and incorporate these Xeriscape type principles into our designs. And certainly this is not the only way, this is not a Bible, it's just sort of an overview of some of the practices that we use here in my firm, but also in Santa Fe in general, because Santa Fe is actually quite progressive when it comes to Xeriscape type practices. Uh-oh, no it's not, there we go. Oops. So something I want to talk about around xeriscaping is it something that typically people will say, oh, xeriscape is that zero scape, meaning nothing, meaning gravel and rocks and weed barrier and very few plantings, maybe some cactus and yucca. But what I actually would like to propose is something that xeric is actually what we can celebrate, something that can be lush and alive. And, oops, sorry. And to do that, I find that when I'm working with clients over these last 15 years, a lot of what I do it's as much about education and inspiration as it is just about fulfilling a need of designing and installing a landscape for people. So I'm always getting at what is it that we value as in our culture, and how is what we do in our profession and in our homes and in our landscapes a reflection of what we value. So really at getting at that, I think, has been helping me be more successful in who I work with and how we work together to fulfill their design intentions. And you'll see as I go through this, the people that I find that I work the best with and seem to be the most satisfied with my work are the ones that we do an iterative process with, and that we can actually have this conversation about how are we reflecting what we value. And so is what we value something that's on autopilot? I find a lot of times people call me and right away the conversation starts with, I really want purple flowers, or I really like that one tree I saw in the corner of such and such. And it's as if what's going to happen is they're going to ask me to do it, I put it in, and then it's done. And as we all know, landscapes are living and they're evolving just like we are in our human bodies and our human relationships. And so what I try to bring forward is that there's nothing that's ever finished. We start by talking, we observe, we do it on paper, and then it's something on the ground and it's changing. And if somebody has the idea, especially because it's Xeriscape, that it's actually kind of a finished product and it's kind of on autopilot or on remote control to be performing when on demand, then it typically doesn't work out to work with me. And not to say that that's a bad way to be, but I just don't even know how to work that way, because when we're doing Xeriscape practices, what we're trying to do is something that's regenerative and beneficial to multiple systems, not just to somebody's aesthetic eye. So again, values-based whole systems design, what we're investing in is something that's regenerative. So when we say restorative, to me it implies restoring it to some original state, and then again it's implying stagnation. So regeneration is something that's ongoing and evolving and creating resilient systems, and that investment to me is mostly about soil and water. Of course, it's about appropriate hardscape choices, appropriate plant choices, and in particular the enlivened people-place connection. So it's about the nature-culture relationship, not just the stuff we put in the ground. And the way we try to do this through our practice is through identifying goals, developing those goals, of course establishing explicit budget. It's all about money when it has to do with any scale of client, the intention behind the process, and making it clear that this is in some ways experimentation. Phased implementation is really important, I think, here in particular because our growing conditions are so tough. We're at 7,000 feet. The sun is very intense. We have very infertile soils, really erosive soils. And then we also have cold winters. We're a zone 5. And so the phased implementation is better economically, and I think it also helps people adjust to changing what they like or don't like. Of course, consistent care and flexibility both in the materials we use, but also flexibility in people's expectations and how they live in their landscape. So the iterative process, I'll just go through this. It's really important, as we all know, to observe where we are, and I really like to work with people who have lived somewhere for at least a year and observed the place where the rain falls, where the snow collects, where they like to sit, where the birds gather, things like that. They record those observations. We begin to sketch out an idea. I develop the idea with particular call-outs saying this is where these areas of activity or areas of planting will be. Then we detail those ideas and then go forward with installation. Now typically, as I mentioned, I like to work with people who prefer to do things in phases. It's typically better economically, and then also when they change their minds, it's not as expensive. We don't have to undo and redo. There's one client, I'll show you her place. Actually, this is an example right here where the hardscape is, that for one whole year all we did was build soil. The very first year all we did was install a rainwater harvesting system. So she was actually willing to take the time and be in that discomfort of not having a, quote, finished product. And I find that to be the most successful type of working process here. And this is another, and for those of you who are professional designers, you probably do this already, but I think it's important, even if you're not a designer, to see as a client, oh, the communication is in what we see on paper, whether it's a plan drawing that calls out the plant species or a three-dimensional rendering like these photo montages that say, this is the before and this is the after, this is the feel. So if we're saying yes to something, what is it we're saying yes to in terms of how it looks, but also what's the function? So what are the function of these plants? Do they attract birds? Do they provide scent? What's the function of these pavers? Are they flexible? Are they a hard enough surface to put a table on? So I find that the clearer I can be and the more detail I can provide at this stage, the more successful we are in our projects. So these are the principles I'd like to propose for Xeriscape. It's sort of a redefinition, again, going back to values and whole systems, and it's slowing down, making things flexible, connecting, circulating, cooling, facilitating redundancy. So this is really important so that there's more than one system, whether it's one system of irrigation or one system of shade or whatever. Facilitating symbiosis, so everything we propose, hopefully in any design, has at least one, if not preferably 3 symbiotic benefits. and then the continual evolution. So the it here is both cultural and ecological, so it means the flexible materials as well as the flexible mentality. So as we all know, plants perform all kinds of environmental services for us, and particularly here in the arid Southwest, where, as I mentioned, we have very erosive soils, and when we do get runoff or rain runoff, it's in the summer when we have monsoon season. It's so impactful. It's this huge deluge in a very short amount of time. For instance, we had a 2-inch rainfall one time in less than 20 minutes, and so what happens is the hillsides run with the water, the rivers run, the arroyos run, and everything gets taken away. So the plants themselves, the leaves help slow the passage of the water, the velocity and the intensity of the water. The roots help hold the water in the soil in place. They are pathways for the water to percolate. They also are a huge amount of biomass provision for the soil. So in all these ways that they perform like physically for the soil and for the water, they also are adding nutrients and of course all the other benefits of plants. So rather than having a bare gravel-laden landscape that sometimes people think of when they think of xeriscape, I actually propose a plant-rich landscape where the roots and the leaves are performing multiple functions to help decrease heat island effect and desertification. And the first and greatest resource, well, they're tied, I think, neck and neck, is soil and water. And so what we do typically, and I'll just go through this quickly, is try to encourage that connection I was referring to earlier between people and place through compost. And we really try to get people to do compost on a daily basis, where they add daily regular life materials like newspaper and egg cartons and things like that are carbonaceous, along with the nitrogen-rich materials like kitchen waste and grass clippings, any kind of manure. And then it's really important here, may not be there, but for people to keep their compost piles wet, and we do that by adding discarded tea or coffee or even water where we've boiled pasta or vegetables and things like that, and get the compost hot enough. Now people get really excited when they're actually making compost, they're turning it on a daily basis. They realize how much they don't have to throw away, how much doesn't have to go to the landfill, and how much can actually be added to their soil. When people see that benefit, I just have been amazed at this aha moment where people turn around and say, oh, I actually have an impact on my garden, on my place. Now, when we're doing larger scale landscapes, of course, we order compost by the cubic yard and we spread it and have it delivered, but we always add compost to the top of the soil. We do not till it in here. We don't want to bring those dormant weed seeds to the surface and create more disturbance. We want to actually build from the top down in that slow generative process of soil building over time. So water, there'll be quite a few slides here on water. And this first section is going to be on passive water harvesting, and these are what we call landform grading, and I know you all might be familiar with this too, but it's really important here because, as I said, we have no or very little vegetative cover, so we have to try to slow and direct the flow of water across the surface, and the way we do this is creating berms and swales on contour, so the water has an opportunity to slow down rather than racing straight down the hill and creating an erosive gully and then ending up somewhere where it's considered a liability. This is one of our projects at the Academy for the Love of Learning at south of town here in Santa Fe in the Juniper Hills. It's an 85-acre site. The place where we actually did the landscaping is on about 7 or 8 acres around this building. So the buildings are, multi-million-dollar facility. And when we first started, it was a construction zone, which you can kind of see here on the left in process. This slope here is a 12% slope, and at the base of it is the main building. So this is the top of the slope here, and the water was running all the way down to the base into the building here. And so what we decided to do, in contrast to what the engineer and the architect had proposed, they were proposing putting the water in a gully this way, going straight down and then ending up in a detention pond, what we call water prisons here. And I said, well, why don't we utilize that resource? So what we decided to do, and what the owner of the facility said yes to, was a massive landform grading. And so you can see how the water was just running off and running down. Eroding was actually going into the building. We went to the top of the slope where the point of origin is for the water runoff. We shot the slope and tried to form these berms and swales on contour. You see right here, we had to use heavy equipment because this is all decomposed granite. It was literally impenetrable in some places. And then we topped the whole area with compost, and the compost we use is actually from the wastewater treatment plant here in Santa Fe, so it's turning human waste and combining it into compost, combining it with yard waste. So it's a very inexpensive, wonderfully nice local source of rich compost. We topped the whole slope, this granite, with compost. Then we seeded with native grasses and wildflowers. Then we topped all of that with this erosion control fabric and staked it down. And this was done just as the monsoon season was starting, so that we were hoping for, and we did actually get a great monsoon and wonderful germination over time. So this is looking sort of down the slope. This is in some areas further down the slope where you can see where the water collected, and where the berms and swales where the vegetative cover, the erosion control mat was starting to erode, and in these moist spots where the water can gather after it's gone through this swale and then down to the next swale and so on, is where the grass really germinates the best. And so what this client decided to do was, this was their first iteration for the landscape, and we did the hardscape, these rock retaining walls too. But then they sat back and they waited to see how people were using the space before they went forward with any other type of landscape. So their first priority was the water and the soil, and then reintroducing some of the native vegetation through seed. So this has been a client I've been working with for about 6 years now. This is another project. We got a federal grant through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. It's called Partners for Wildlife, and I'm working with the La Resolana community. This is the neighborhood, the streets, these are the houses. And then we did, what we proposed was this sort of landform grading all along this arroyo that drains into the Santa Fe River here. So again, rather than having all this water run as fast as it can here and end up in this detention pond that was required by the engineer, we wanted to stop and slow the water and direct it this way in a more circuitous route. And so we did landform grading, same thing here. The soils are really, really bare, lots of sand, not much vegetative cover. So we did the berms and swales. We also did these things these are called media lunas, or half moons. They're one rock dams, check dams. So what happens is these create little, small, slow areas for the water to collect and gather and for seed to gather. So rather than, again, the water racing downhill, it goes slowly in a more circuitous route and can kind of gather here where the seed is, and so we can have successful germination. This is looking back at some of the houses. You see there's a lot of roof surfaces that the water runs off, and was going down and scouring all these gullyways into this arroyo and eventually down into the river. All this sediment deposition was happening. So we had a number of community work days and educational workshops where we taught people how to do these one rock dams, lining the gullies, and then we actually planted 250 native plant species, shrubs, all along the dam, all along the arroyo. So those species again add the biomass and the vegetative cover to help hold the soil. They also are adding wonderful biodiversity. The other thing we do, in addition to berms and swales, is a type of landform grading where it doesn't necessarily have to be on a slope, is bioswales. And I apologize, I borrowed these images from the web, and they're not very high resolution, but they just show you how basically we work with sunken planters rather than raised planters, so that the plants and the soil can receive the water runoff from hard surfaces or higher surfaces, whether it's a roadway or a sidewalk that's adjacent. And this is a client south of Santa Fe as well, and he had this bare landscape, and he got a landscaping plan done, and he met with me just to get a second opinion, and he said, well, I don't really like this fancy plan. And I said, well, what is it you would like? And he said, I just want what's out here. I want something natural. I don't want a fancy irrigation system. And I said, well, can we use the water you have off your roof? And so we did the same thing all around the whole property. These are the canales, or the downspouts where the water runs. It was hitting and scouring here and then just running and eroding, and there's no vegetative cover to hold it. So what we ended up doing was the same thing and created a bunch of bioswales all around the house. Now these typically have to be a minimum of 5 feet from the base of the structure so that there's not water being absorbed into the houses, especially here where we have lots of adobe and stucco. So we did a series of bioswales all the way around the perimeter of the house, so that the water, rather than scouring and running down here and causing issues on the driveway and on the slope, were retained and created a nice wet area for all this vegetative cover. So what we did was we just did the bioswales, we topped everything with compost, and then we seeded. We did do a temporary irrigation system here, just off the timer off of his potable water source to help facilitate germination. And then those will be pulled and or activated only when they're necessary. So he got sort of this native landscape with it seems sort of like a heavy touch at first, but it's really minimal compared to putting in the landscape that was proposed, which was much more formalistic and introducing all kinds of water in different zones from the potable water source. So here are just some more images around the house of those bioswales. These are the deep spots, the ones that are the greenest, and these higher spots are more about the circulation route where he put the flagstone pathways. This is a berm and swale, kind of series of berm and swale within the circular island of the driveway. And you can see the wet spots are the greenest there. And This is a client that has 2 acres, and she's the one who decided to just do soil building first after she had done the rainwater harvesting tanks. And we have acequias here, which are irrigation ditches we use for agricultural properties. And so this was she has water rights, which means surface water. So this is an orchard, and then we planted new orchard trees in this area. But what we did was we directed the water through this trench. We created these sort of meandering bioswales. They're quite large. There are these areas right here that are sunken, these right here that are rich with vegetation, so that those are where the trees are planted in the native understory, understory to attract pollinators like clovers and things like that, and grasses are planted. And then we left the areas high like this because the client wanted to create this sort of park-like setting with meandering pathways and places to gather for her neighbors that can walk on her property. So again, this was done iteratively over time, but basically we're directing the water into these low spots, and then it flows from that trench this way, and it goes this way like a meander through the bioswales. This was before we got started. This is another property where we did landform grading. This is a whole complex of apartments, and as you see there at the base of the slope, again, no vegetative cover. We followed the prescription of an engineer and worked with him. He designed these check dams that are made out of railroad ties and then lined with landscape fabric. Typically, we like to have something that's less solid, because when you have a force of water going straight down the hill like this and it hits something that hard, what will happen is it'll find the quickest escape route and it'll go this way and start to cut. So typically we like something that's more permeable, like those one-walk dams with a cobble, but we followed his prescription because all the people were in these apartments were getting a lot of runoff, and their patios and living rooms were getting flooded. So we did these check dams, same thing, berms and swales. We seeded everything with grass and wildflower seed, and then topped everything with the erosion control fabric. And this was about 5 acres worth of this type of work. This is pumice wick, and maybe you know about what these are. This is below ground water catchment and directing that water to the roots of plants below ground. So this water takes water from the roof and directs it underground into what it was kind of like a burrito. It's lining a trench with pumice stone, landscape fabric, and then 4-inch perforated pipe. So the water goes into the pipe, settles into the trench, the water gets held in the pores of the pumice, and then is taken up by the roots of the plants. All of these plants all around the house are absorbing that water. They have pumice wicks underneath, so this is passively irrigated. This is a simple diagram from Santa Fe Permaculture. They drew this just to show what that looks like. So here's where the water flows into the catch box, down through the 4-inch perforated pipe. This is the pumice stone, and of course the plant roots go into that. So the trench itself is covered with soil, by ideally a minimum of 1 foot, preferably more. And the one thing about these, this is just the schematic of where that pumice wick is around this house, or pumice wicks are. The thing about these is the water is there when the water is already there, whereas if you're using a cistern or something, you're storing it for future use. So these are great because they help inhibit evapotranspiration and evaporation. But again, it's not water stored for future use necessarily. And then active water harvesting, our favorite source, primary source of irrigation is gray water and black water, and we actually have a really progressive ordinance here in the state of New Mexico, and in Santa Fe in particular, where we can use gray water. So that's the water from the laundry and from the showers. And in this case, this was a gray water system that was part of that Fish and Wildlife grant. This came off one of the residents' houses. This is a 300-gallon tank. We can only store gray water here for 48 hours, and then it has to be distributed through subsurface drip. So we're using that to irrigate the upper arroyo plants, 125 plants with this gray water system. We use that as a primary system because it's the most reliable system. We generate water out of the house on a daily basis, typically, hopefully no more than 60 gallons per day per person, but that's a lot more than pulling fresh water from the well, and also better and more reliable than waiting for precipitation. There's a lot more, sorry about that, some details on gray and black water and some of the resources I list at the back of the talk, but there's you have to have a shutoff so that if you do need to shut the gray water off and direct all the water to the sewer, you can, and also have to have plenty of cleanouts so that the system can be cleaned from lint and hair and things like that get in the system. Now black water, we treat it with aerobic decomposition. This is what's called the sludge hammer, and this is how we irrigate trees and perennials. We can't do annual edibles, but again, it's through subsurface drip. And of course, this is one of my favorite ways to encourage people to connect to their landscape, to their food actually, and to their plants and soil. Very simple, low-tech, easy to do dish pans. And it's amazing how addicted people get to using these. Doing dishes and catching the water, people realize how much water goes down the drain. And what happens is they end up walking out the kitchen door multiple times a day and watering their favorite plant, especially when it's hot out in July here. And so this is one of those really simple low-tech ways to encourage that connection between people and place. It's also a lot less expensive than the whole system. Of course, this doesn't serve as an irrigation system for the whole landscape, but it's a way to prioritize and give water to those zone 1 plants that are closer into the house that need a little more attention. These are just some examples of cisterns. This is above ground. These are above ground, obviously. This is one at a client's place that has like a rural property, and we did something they wanted to see, and I think it's good for people to see the actual conveyance. So the water comes off the roof, down the gutter, and into the cistern. And for this one here, people use a submersible pump, and then it's connected to a hose, and they hand water. So that's another good way to facilitate connection. This one runs off an automated irrigation system because the property is quite large. This is a below-ground system, which is great, especially if people don't want to see the tank. It's also a lot more expensive to do the excavation and then do something with the soil and the compaction. And then when there are maintenance issues, it's a little bit trickier to get in there and do something. This is at the Lady Bird Johnson facility. I just want to show how cisterns can actually be something that's beautiful, that we can celebrate what water looks like as it's being harvested. This one here and this one here are both by Buster Simpson. He's a fantastic ecological artist, and he's showing this beautiful palm, this hand that's upturned, receiving this water coming down. And this is also a way to slow water coming off the gutter, planted and celebrated as it comes down. This is what's a rain vessel company here in Santa Fe, and they're decorating their cisterns like Native American pots. And then there are these just simple kind of low-tech ones that hug the wall. So cisterns in combination with gray water, pumice wicks, and other passive forms of irrigation like the landform grading are our primary systems for irrigation. We use potable water as an absolute last resort. So here, if you want to take a break and ask questions, we can, or we can keep going.
So if anyone has a question, you can go ahead and type it in the question box. Christy, I wanted to ask you about the one rock dams. That's something I became familiar with when I moved out to Santa Fe. And I wonder if you could just explain that a little bit further, and if you have any comments on what size rocks you use for the one rock dams.
I think that's like a really good question. Well, the one rock dams are really nice because they're low tech, and we use those in that's kind of creating a redundant system, again, in combination with berms and swales. Now, sometimes people say we shouldn't do berms and swales at all because we're causing all kinds of disturbance. When we use one rock dams alone is when there's a place that's not too steep, so they can't perform that big of a function like a berm and swale can, like on some of those steeper slopes that I showed you. But a one rock dam is something, you can even do it not just with cobble, like those cobbles are, I would say, what, 4 to 6 inch cobble, and those are pretty big because the scale of that site was so large, and also because the water runoff was so great. So you need something that can actually be kind of embedded in the soil and hold the water runoff. It can withstand that. Whereas if you're somewhere where it's less steep, you wouldn't have to use as big a cobblestone. And the idea is that they hold the soil, and then in between those stones, because they're uniformly round, they're not locking together, closing the space. They're uniformly round, so in between those round cobbles are little passageways and pathways for the water to trickle and flow and have more of a meandering route. It's also a place where the seed can gather and take up that moisture. Another simple way to do a one rock dam, which isn't using a rock as like a check dam, is using any kind of detritus or debris like yard waste or tree branch clippings and things like that. And we do that all the time. We lay them in one layer on the soil down slope, starting at the highest point. You always want to start at the point of origin, and lay them just in an informal way on the ground, because that's, again, here providing organic matter. It's also slowing the fall, the hardness, the intensity of the precipitation on the ground, as well as the pathway going down. So basically, it's like if you're skiing down a hill, if you get on your skis and go straight down as fast as you can, you have less control, and you're probably going to cause damage not only to yourself, but to where you're skiing. If you can imagine the route of your skis, where if you go slow and you take turns and go a roundabout way, it's a better, safer, easier path. The same is true for water down the slope.
Okay, thanks. That's great. Yeah, I think in the when they do stream restoration in the east, they often put the branches and organic debris to create those meanders, and so that's a good analogy or a good equivalence. Thanks. You can go ahead and move on with hardscaping.
Okay, so on hardscape, again, what I'd like to bring forward is just some of the materials that we use here in Santa Fe, but the most important thing, I think, again, is talking about utilizing flexible materials, so materials that aren't hard and hot, and also one of my favorite principles is the least permanent action first. So that typically is something that can be changed over time or evolve over time. Excuse me, this is just a simple illustration for any kind of flagstone or hard surface that we do use. We want it to be above grade so that anything, that water that falls on it can go to the plantings that are below grade. The soil falls a little bit away from the surface. These are usually set in compacted crusher pine, so again it's permeable. And anytime there's any sort of joint or seam in between the stone or whatever material, we use a polymeric sand fill, which actually creates a binding between the stones, but it allows for water percolation down into the soil. This is one of the materials we use. It's porphyry from Mexico. So again, this is all set in those crusher fines. It's higher than the adjacent beds and plantings, and then it's sealed with polymeric sand, so it's solid enough to create a surface for patio furniture for people to walk on, but it's permeable so the water can actually circulate. Some more surfaces, we use flagstone quite a bit. This flagstone is nice because it's quarried locally. It's just about an hour away, and we do the hand chisel joints. And again, this patio surface and this patio surface are sealed with that polymeric sand, but it's permeable. And then the flagstone pavers are just set in the soil. I wanted to say something about this landscape because this may not look like a xeric landscape or what we think of as xeric, but in my opinion it very much is. It's on the east side in Santa Fe where we have lots of deciduous, mature deciduous trees, and so there's all that ground cover, that fall of leaves in the autumn, and it creates a nice, more rich soil. And so what we prescribed for this particular landscape was mimicking what we have in our mountain areas here with the aspen trees, the red twig dogwoods, columbine, there's heuchera, little bits of fescue, and some other ground covers here. So this is xeric in that it's native. These are appropriate plants for the type of soil we have in this place. It's also a pretty shady garden because we have these large mature elm trees here. So again, it's the appropriate plant in the appropriate place. Soil building, we're using organic type mulches like the compost and the shredded bark that build soil over time. These are just some more pathways to show you what we like to use here. Again, these are just flagstone pavers. You see that they're set above the surrounding grade. This is just an example of what one of my clients did. This is a bluegrass, which is a cool season grass, which I do not recommend. She had already done this before we came on the scene, but it's a very small area, so it's okay, but just something that's decorative. And this is a native ground cover here, Antonaria rosea, pussy toes. It's one of my favorites. And then the client used old tiles and old dishes and things and filled in the cracks between her flagstones, so it's something that's lovely. Again, it's xeric, this part is xeric, and the lavender and even the gravel mulch for this, but it's something that's lively and not just this sort of denuded, hot, hard surface. And this is a crusher fine pathway. This is the pathway that I showed you in the earlier slide where we did the bioswales off the acequia ditch where we did the orchard. And this I just wanted to show because what we use is this really nice 1/8-inch thick 20-foot steel plates, and we rebar weld those in place to create a rigid edge in which we put the crusher fine gravel mix. And I just wanted to show the height of this pathway because the pathway itself is permeable for the water and nutrients to circulate down into the soil and to the surrounding soil, and also it's higher than. So what we did here then was we added the compost and then the seed and plants and everything, so it's below the height of the pathway. And this is just another example of hardscape here. This is obviously a hot tub and an outdoor fire area, and this was just an option to really get the color of the flagstone to pop. It's still permeable. These help lock those pavers in place better, but it allows for percolation of nutrients and of water in particular. These are just small little Mexican beach pebbles. And this is another one of my favorite landscapes. This one is really lush. These are almost all native plants, native to New Mexico and or the West. And here we did a more contemporary look with the snap cut pavers, the same quarry, but they're snap cut, and some of them are thick enough that they serve as steps and soil retention. And then lots of plantings close into those steps because that's where the moisture congregates. This is a really rich, densely planted landscape. Their primary source of irrigation is rainwater, and then they have lots of edibles, and then all these plantings back here are really diverse species to help attract wildlife and pollinators. And this client is committed. They have a really big, right back here you can't see it, but a compost system. They compost daily. They remove none of their yard waste. Everything they either cut up or lay in sheets across the surface. They're committed to building soil over time, so every spring and every fall, and you can kind of see it in here, they add manure and straw and any of their yard waste and kitchen waste as their compost system for building soil here for their landscape. This is just showing terraces and retention. So when we have a big slope like this that we have to hold, rather than pouring a hard impermeable concrete wall, which is very expensive and inflexible, we try to use flexible materials like this stone. Again, this is locally quarried. These are set back, and there's no concrete used at all. These are just set into the ground to create the foundation. And this is the client who, after we did the hardscape, we topped everything with locally produced steer manure that was close by, because we had 2 acres to cover, and then we also had a lumber mill that was literally like a block away, and we used all the chips from their lumber mill on top of the compost for 1 year to help build the soil, to suppress the weeds, and try to get some organic matter built for water retention. And then we started doing the plantings over time. More materials for erosion control, flexible materials. This is what happened at one place where we couldn't do the berms and swales upslope. This is the neighbor's property, and so all this erosion happened after one of the water runoffs. I'm sorry, one of the big rain events. And so the client finally said, okay, we ended up being able to do berms and swales here on the extent of their property. We did seeding and the erosion control fabric, and then, sort of mitigated this issue here across this big surface. So what happens, water just obviously made big cuts into this crusher pine surface. This is just another example of hardscape materials. Again, the flagstone, and we use local moss rock here to create this mini retention wall. It also has these little seats in it for little kids to be able to sit around the fire ring. Again, just showing permeability and porosity and flexibility. And this is just a gravel surface here, again, for the water to be able to percolate. We do not use weed barrier. I don't really advocate it in any case. I don't think it works. I think it doesn't function. I mean, in some ways, maybe if you're, like we had to use it on those check dams with the railroad ties, but otherwise I don't. I think it's a waste of material and labor. This is just more of a contemporary version of one of our hardscapes, and this client wanted something that was more sleek, so we did go ahead and do a concrete surface. I just am going to segue from this into pergolas and portals, what we call portals, which are porch covers, and vertical type gardens, because in the Southwest here we need shade badly. This is a south and west facing portal, so we designed this really simple sort of porch cover, and then the concrete patio itself. This is another option for a more flexible material. This is we used, these are spruce posts, locally milled spruce, and then this willow that was from a ranch nearby that they considered the willow to be like a nuisance species, so we just took it and wove it in here for that sort of dappled shade off the portal. So in a xeriscape area, especially close into houses and, to the house walls and to living areas, it's nice to create as much shade and cooling off those hot, hard surfaces as possible, so create a little cooler microclimate. This is at the Academy for the Love of Learning again. This is a huge wall that's south-facing, and this is the dining area inside, and then out here they have a courtyard area. So rather than having this hot reflective heat, we decided to do a trellis out of steel and cable, and these are grapes that are planted. You can tell this is newly planted, but now, since this has been built, the grapes are up here, and so they really are enjoying that nice cool green cover, plus they're edible. Another example of vertical shade, edible shade. Very simple milled posts tied together, and then grapes growing over the top. And what's nice here is, of course, these are deciduous, so in the winter it allows the light to come through once these leaves are fallen. So this is a warm spot in the winter and a cool spot in the summer. So again, this is zone 1, close into the house, and they can come down. And as you see with the pavers, there are plantings in between the flagstone. So again, it's allowing for that percolation and circulation. And also these green spots of ground cover help cool that hot, hard surface. This is another vertical. This is that same garden, and this obviously they needed retention, so we did this rock wall. This is out of moss rock, no concrete. These are just set in place and using soil, and then the plantings, the ground covers and plantings are put here. to help hold the water, but they create this wonderful, cool, rich, vibrant, colorful surface that's enjoyable. So it's, again, creating cooling, softening, texture, and multiple benefit. These are, of course, pollinator attractors, and they provide scent and texture. There's a cat that just walked into the room. And this is some more examples of vertical shade, again, trying to create those cool microclimates. This right here is just a close-up. This is a fence, actually, not just a trellis, so the client opted to use this kind of support structure. And what we'll do, we haven't planted them yet because this is another phased implementation. We've been working together for about 3 years on this project, and we'll be planting grapes here this year, so they wanted to have a kind of a living fence. This right here, I just wanted to show as an example of a really simple, low-tech, inexpensive way to create vertical shade and cooling is remesh. This is that 4x4 square steel that you buy in sheets, just like at Lowe's, and we just took this and tied it up here to these posts, and this is a support structure for these honeysuckles. And this is an espalier, and typically espalier is not the easiest thing for us to do here in the Southwest, but this is a southeast facing wall, so it's not as hot as afternoon wall. And this is an apple tree, and this is a wonderful way to create this geometric form and this structure, this visual interest, even like this in the winter. But then you can imagine the spring and summer when this is blooming and fruiting. And so again, it's another opportunity for edibles against a hot, hard wall, and also cooling and softening of that wall. And these are just some other simple low-tech kind of trellis systems out of tamarisk and willow. Another, something more formal, but this is really nice because, again, it creates a definition around the zone 1 area, cooling and softening, and it's also a support structure for plants to grow up. I think vertical gardening is really important, especially in hot climates like this. This is just this is that place that has the concrete patio. This is the front beds, and this is just an example of flexibility. So these are edible beds, and we did them in kind of a rectilinear, more contemporary type style. The client wasn't sure how much they wanted to do edibles, how much they could commit to them. They have 2 young kids. So we did them right in the front yard. We're making a claim of values, saying that what we value is food, and we also value the iterative process and experimentation. So their kitchen's here. This is obviously a rainwater harvesting barrel. And then these beds were laid as the opportunity for them to seed and plant as they wanted to have edibles, and as they saw that they would be able to take care of them. This is just a simple crusher fine pathway that is sort of like an implied meander. So there's access to the beds all the way around, and these are sunken slightly so that the water from the surface goes into the beds themselves. And they did plant sunflowers and lettuce and garlic and all kinds of things. And then one of the beds, they said, you know what, it's just too much. And so they wanted to cover that. So this was another client willing to experiment over time with their landscape. And this, I put on here the word germinate again, just as a visual peak of interest to connect people to place and have some other kind of interest, like looking at something, providing an opportunity to see something differently. This is another, as I mentioned, we specialize in edible beds. I believe if we're going to use water, especially if it's potable, it should go towards food and cultivating food and connecting to how we can grow and eat our food. This is a client who wanted something a little more formal, so we used the local quarried stone. These are raised. Typically I like sunken beds here because, again, the water flows into them. But this client is a little bit older. She wanted something more formal. She wanted these boulders or something to be able to sit on as she gardens. So this is just an example of her garden. Her primary source of irrigation is rainwater. And she has about 20,000 gallon tank capacity, so she grows food, tons of food, actually too much for herself. And these are some of the edibles that we planted and harvested in her garden. This is just one harvest we've planted for years with her now. This is another low-tech, very simple, flexible edible beds. These are sunken, and these are the walkways in between the beds. And this is just buffalo grass. It's one of my favorite native grasses here in New Mexico, and it's a stolen interest grass. So it's really tough. It can tolerate foot traffic. And then these beds are sunken because just outside this fence is a roadway. So the water from the road spills and goes into these beds here. And there's also this patio surface, and this is the kitchen door entry. So it's the zone 1, most water intensive and the most labor intensive. It's also right outside the kitchen window right here. So people can look out and see, oh, this is how our garden grows and what food's available for harvest that night. This is just another example of something I really like to use, which is repurposed materials. This is urbanite or recycled concrete. This is a client who wanted edibles all around the whole landscape. In this area, these beds are a little bit further away from the kitchen, so something that's closer into zone 1 would be annual edibles like lettuces and things like that. These are perennial edibles. Of course, this is asparagus, and these are strawberries. These are wonderful in this bed because they sort of cascade over and sort of soften this concrete wall. But it's a wonderful use of a material that's flexible. It's also very heavy. It can hold soil really nicely, and it's a great place for the runners of these strawberries and things to cascade. I'll just go into planting unless anybody has questions now. And no?
Yeah.
So I'll skip that. Sorry?
You can go ahead.
Okay. So I wanted to just say something about plants. A lot of times, like I said, people say, well, I want something that's purple or yellow, or I don't want something that's messy. And I find that it's really helpful when working with people or even making the design decisions myself, again, going back to what am I providing and what are the benefits of the design specifications. So yes, these are the names of the plants and types of plants, but I think more importantly is what they provide and what are their ecological services. Are they a wildlife habitat provider? Do they attract pollinators? When do they bloom? Is there winter interest? Do they stabilize the soil and so on? Medicinals? Do they provide shade and so on? So when somebody gets a chance to see this and they get introduced to a whole new plant palette instead of species, typically there's more excitement and more acceptance of what it is that they see in the landscape. I think there's also heightened valuing of what they see, so it's not just seen as a pretty lipstick plant that's red. You know, it's something that's actually doing multiple things, and it's not just about satisfying somebody's need for eye candy. So I think it's just important to talk about the attributes of plants. So I won't go through every single species ever because there are so many that I think are great. These are just a few that I really like. But again, looking at, like, for instance, this is a burr and gamble oak. They're native here. They do really well in New Mexico. They provide wonderful fall color. They have a gorgeous bark, and they're food for wildlife. This right here I just wanted to show as a landscape. This was a client who wanted to take out her turf lawn. She had a cool season turf in this area. And she said, I want something xeric. And I said, okay. Let's do something xeric, because she had all these mature trees around the house that was part shade. So what we did was we utilized a lot of native plants, including, here's a gamble oak right here. This is a silverbeard grass and some native ground covers and some vines to go up this fence in the back to create what I, again, consider a xeric landscape. It's also very diverse, and we have the sort of permeable flagstone pavers in between. But the palette itself is really diverse in terms of texture and color and multiple function, too. Shrubs, I think these are my favorite landscape type plant to use. And again, what are the benefits? What are they providing? This is a landscape bed right here off a driveway. It softens and cools this hard wall. This is a really diverse sort of layered planting. Again, trying to provide, this is fruit and bloom in the spring. This is a medicinal. This is a ephedra. This right here is Philadelphus, or little baby mock orange, Prunus specia. So fruit, texture, color, multiple types of foliage. This is Holodiscus. It's a great one for holding soil, especially on rocky, steep slopes. And of course, that magnificent sort of infrastructural shape of the agave, Perry's agave. Grasses, again, are wonderful for xeric landscapes. They're also really low maintenance and have virtually no pest or disease issues. These are just some of my favorites, and these are natives. And this is just to show, this is the sand love grass, and this is just this wonderful sea of grass. They just keep seeding. This is what they look like in summer and fall, and this is in winter after a snowstorm, and sort of flatten them out. And again, the sculptural interest is so valuable, and what we do is we leave these in place because this mulches the ground around it, and then these only get cut back once a year in March, and then again we put all that into the compost. Same thing here. These are wonderful, rich, deeply rooted species that are great for holding soil. This is that buffalo grass, the stoloniferous grass that runs, above ground runners. It helps hold the soil really well. Vines, as I mentioned before, wonderful cooling opportunity. This is a place that used to have 2 driveways around the house. The client didn't want a second driveway, so we reclaimed it by building soil with compost and mulch, and then we put these trellises in to grow grapes. So we have sort of this it's like a living fence. There's a series of trellises that's between the neighbor and then the house itself. This is a native Arizona grape, of course Virginia creeper, and then this is the Virgin's bower, which are wonderful xeric species for vertical gardening. And they can also be planted high up on a wall and cascade down, so they don't have to be trained to go up. But we've had clients with like those high terrace walls, and they plant something like a vine and then let them cascade and soften and cool that wall from above. Perennials, again, multiple services that they provide in thousands and thousands of species. I did want to say, just again talking about Xeriscape can also be in the shade and involve shade-tolerant plants. Like this is a companion and one of my favorite. This isn't rotundifolia, but rotundifolia is one of my favorite nice shade-tolerant Xeriscape plants. This right here is Navajo tea. It's one of my favorites. I mean, this is indestructible. It doesn't even like water, and it blooms. It's just gorgeous. The sort of structural pop right there is just a lovely element in the landscape. And this is Melonpodium, or Blackfoot daisy, is one of my favorites as well. And this one, Jachinaria, hummingbird trumpets, fantastic color. This is a nice late summer bloomer. It's great for hummingbirds. Anyway, we could go on and on about perennials, but just in general, understanding services they provide, and also that they don't have to just be hot sun perennials that go with cactus and gravel. And just, I'm going to finish up here with maintenance. Again, going back to the idea that it's evolving and ongoing. There's no such thing as the off-season. Specifically in Santa Fe and in the Southwest, we don't necessarily get winter moisture, so we have to be very much active in the winter and hand water every 3 to 4 weeks. And this is where those systems, like if there's a cistern with a submersible pump or something, or pumice wicks do come into place if there is precipitation, that things have to have water once every 3 to 4 weeks, so it's consistency. Also, it's a great opportunity to observe and reflect on what has or hasn't worked over the seasons, and pruning trees and shrubs is when we do that in the winter, a time to order and save seed, do different layouts for the next garden beds in the coming year. And then the time that we feed, mostly spring and fall here, so we do iron and nitrogen in the spring and colloidal phosphate in the fall. And spring and fall is also when we always add compost and mulch to every garden, again, feeding the living soil that's going to be that water sponge for us throughout the year. Just going back in review to the Xeriscape principles of slowing things down, that's water and ourselves. Observing, being flexible, using flexible materials, connecting to place, connecting the elements to each other, so the vertical landscape or the vertical garden connected to the patio below it and how the people actually function in that space, circulating the nutrients, circulating people and connection, cooling for sure. Redundancy, I think, is really important. So what's holding soil in place, what's building soil, where is the water coming from, having more than one source to satisfy the need, hopefully facilitating symbiosis and evolving with the whole system over time. And these are just some resources, and you can, of course, I didn't put mine on here, it's on the front page, so you can find that, bradicle.com, and you can contact me about anything, whether it's the water, soil, plants, materials, or connecting with any of these great resources. These are local people that personally, and their books and their resources I rely on all the time. So we have a great network here in the Southwest. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Christy. That was great. I really love your table of plants, ecological services when I teach sustainable landscape classes at George Washington University, and that's one thing that the students are all required to do, is to make a table of plants with their ecological services. So it's great to see that's being done in other parts of the country as well. And Christy, again, I really appreciate your time, and I know you had a last-minute computer crisis, which rattled you a little bit, but you did a great job, so thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it, and certainly anybody is welcome to contact me if you have questions or ideas or anything else. Thank you.
Great, and that was, can you just give your...
It's bradicle.com, and radicle, is, you probably all know, is the botanic term that I mean, which is the first root that emerges from a seed once it germinates. So it's bradicle.com, bradicle.com here in Santa Fe.
Great. And we do have a comment from Susan Gitlin that you gave a great seminar, so thanks again.
Thank you so much.